elected officials, and distinguished guests. This morning, President Obama once again issued a statement full of verbal gymnastics and shameful word games, adding fuel to the fire, adding insult to injury, and conspiring with the denialist regime in Turkey to downgrade our cause. However, the Armenians worldwide refuse to be sidetracked by such shameful games. We refuse to have our cause obstructed by such lies and denials. That is why today the United Armenian Council has proudly invited all the way from London a very distinguished international jurist who's on the front lines of our cause in bringing our demands to the international courts and international community, and not simply getting sidetracked by these denials, by these words of massacre, tragedy, etc. We have with us Mr. Geoffrey Robertson. He has a very distinguished and long record, but I will make it brief, otherwise I'll run the risk of making the introduction longer than his keynote speech. He's a founder and joint head of Doughty Street Chambers, the largest law firm on human rights in London. He's had a distinguished career as a trial and appellate counsel, an international judge, and author of several legal textbooks. He served as a UN appeal judge and first president of the UN War Crimes Court in Sierra Leone. He is the author of the leading textbook on international criminal law titled Crimes Against Humanity, The Struggle for Global Justice. Not surprisingly, the book contains extensive references to the Armenian genocide. He has also written the authoritative legal analysis which proves that Turkey committed genocide as it is defined in international law, and he has shown how the UK's recent refusal to confirm this fact stems from its fears of Turkish economic reprisals. He has authored the magisterial document filed in the European Court of Human Rights, which sets Nagorno-Karabakh's or Artsak's claim to independent statehood. Even though he hails from London, but he is a native of Sydney, Australia, where he was born. He received his BA from Sydney University and LLB in honors in 1970. He attended Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar along with President Clinton in 1972. He has honorary doctorates in laws from Sydney, Brunel, and Bucharest universities. He's a quiz counsel as of 1988, a judge in England for the past 17 years. He's an appeal judge at UN War Crimes Court from 2002 and 2007, and more importantly, court president from 2002 to 2004. He's a distinguished jurist member of the Internal Justice Council of United Nations from 2008 to 2012. He received the New York Bar Association's Award for Achievement in International Law and Policy in 2011. From 1990 to present, he's the founder and head of the Doughty Street Chambers. He has served as counsel in over 200 cases in administrative, international, criminal, and public law in High Court and Court of Appeal, the House of Lords, and the UK Supreme Court, as well as the High Courts of Singapore, Malaysia, Antigua, Trinidad and Tobago, Anguilla, and final Court of Appeal in Hong Kong. He also served on cases in the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and World Bank Arbitration Court. He's currently acting for the government of Mauritius and for Armenia in European Court of Human Rights. Mr. Robertson has been a keynote speaker in many international conventions. He's a master of the Middle Temple and a visiting professor in human rights at the University of London, Queen Mary College, and the New College of the Humanities. He lives in London with his wife and 2 college-age children. And to sum up, Mr. Robertson is a champion of justice and the truth, which makes him a great champion of the Armenian cause. Mr. Robertson, please.
It is a mighty honor, ladies and gentlemen, a day of overwhelming sadness, as you recall the 2 million of your people driven into the wilderness by the wicked Turkish government of the time. We remember their sufferings as they were starved and raped and murdered, as that government knew they would be starved and raped and murdered at that time. But by commemorating them, we resolve not only to make them martyrs, but to ensure that the cause that they were martyred for will eventually triumph. Because this is not just a question, is it, of sorrow and sadness all that time ago. The attempt to exterminate a race, because that is what it was, is not just unforgettable 98 years later. It is unforgivable unless and until the perpetrators, the state of Turkey, makes amends. Because this shouldn't just be a day of sadness. It should be a day first of anger, righteous anger, and then a day to demand justice. I want in this address to you today to explain why Armenians deserve justice, first in relation to the Turkish government for what was legally genocide, and secondly against the Azerbaijan government for their new threats of genocide against the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh. And I want to explain how the government of the United States can help in both cases. Now, I'm not a historian, I'm a judge. I apply the law to evidence that is gathered by historians. And that's how I came first to study the Armenian genocide, when several of your people came to me in my chambers in London to ask my opinion. You see, back in 1915, it was the British who had been the first to denounce the massacres by the Turks in 1915. And you know what they called it, what they got France and Russia as well as Britain to call it at a conference in 1915, the first time the phrase had ever been heard in the world. They called it a crime against humanity, and they promised that the perpetrators would be punished. Winston Churchill, the great British leader, then called it a crime without a name. And the British, you know, were as good as their word. They rounded up 67 Turkish officials, took them to Malta to try them for this crime against humanity. But it was a crime not only without a name, it turned out to be a crime without a law, because they found out from the evidence they gathered, and we're talking about 1919 when the evidence was fresh, they found that these Turkish officials who had been responsible for rounding up Armenians and sending them into the desert, for killing the men and for sending the women and old men and children into the desert, had been officials. They'd been authorized by the government. And there was then no international criminal law that could convict government servants for obeying the law of the time. So those 69 officials had to be released. And only in 1933 did a brilliant legal professor called Raphael Lemkin find a solution he found a name for the crime that Winston Churchill had said was a crime without a name. And the name he found in 1933 was genocide. And what in 1933 did Raphael Lemkin apply it to? In 1933, Hitler had barely started on his persecution against the Jews. That wasn't in question. No, Raphael Lemkin applied it to the Armenian massacres. That was the crime without a name that needed a name, that needed an international law against it. It was before Hitler started. Of course, Hitler got underway, and we all remember, it should be engraved on everyone's mind, what Hitler said on the borders of Poland as he was enthusing his troops to show no mercy to the Poles. He was encouraging them to kill the Polish intelligentsia, the Polish leadership, to show absolutely no mercy because, said Hitler, who now remembers the Armenians? That was what Hitler said. Who now remembers the Armenians? Of course, no one did except Raphael Lemkin, and he fought that lonely struggle. It wasn't till 1948 when a very brilliant, I'm proud to say, brilliant Australian, Dr. H.V. Evatt, who was the president of the General Assembly of the United Nations, understood what Lemkin was going on about and introduced, based on Lemkin's inspiration, the Genocide Convention, the day after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the Genocide Convention is very clear. It makes it an international crime, prosecutable anywhere, to destroy a national group. And you can do that, says the Genocide Convention, by killing part of them, or by this. And this was drafted just to take into account the Armenian genocide by deliberately inflicting on a group conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction in whole or part. Now that was exactly what was done to the Armenians in 1915. They had inflicted upon them, all 2 million, conditions of life that were calculated to bring about their partial destruction, and it brought about the destruction of almost 3/4 of them. Now, there is no doubt at all that what happened was genocide. No doubt legally at all. So why does the UK government now, like the United States government, refuse to call it what it is, genocide? Well, said the UK government, the evidence isn't sufficiently unequivocal. There are historians who disagree. There was no order signed by Talat to exterminate the race. Well, of course, this is ridiculous. The evidence is overwhelming. It's not for historians to decide, it's for judges to decide, looking at the evidence. It said there was no order to exterminate. Ladies and gentlemen, there was no order from Hitler, was there, to exterminate the Jews? We never found an order to that effect. There was no order from the head of the Hutus in Rwanda to exterminate the Tutsis. Those genocides were done without an order. They're obvious inference from the historical facts. Well, why was the British government, like the American government, afraid to use the word genocide? What I did was to file a number of Freedom of Information Act requests to get at the truth behind this volte-face, why Britain was not saying what it said at the time. And what I discovered were all these memoranda to ministers from the Foreign Office saying the position we're taking is unethical. They actually admitted that. We're doing something unethical, but it's in our commercial, strategic, and political interest to pretend that it wasn't genocide, because the Turks are neuralgic. They use that word, neuralgic, utterly neurotic about it. Irrationally neurotic was what the British secretly concluded, and that they would get very angry and refuse the use of Turkey for strategic reasons and would cut off economic assistance. So I exposed this. I felt that Britain was actually, by making these bogus excuses for not saying it was genocide, to protect Turkey, a NATO member, from going crazy if it did, was hiding the truth. We know the history, it's there in the books, the massacres and pogroms of the 1890s when the Ottoman Empire was called the sick man of Europe, that hideous burning to death of Armenians at Urfa Cathedral. Over 1,000 of them were burnt to death, and that was 1898. It behoved the Turkish government to keep this down, but yet in the 1910, 1911, the Turkification program, Armenians were called by the official newspaper tubercular microbes. You get this kind of physical nastiness that is typical of the build-up to genocide. The CUP, the young Turkish organization, started to change the names of towns from Christian names to Muslim names. They passed laws that seized the assets of Armenians. If you had a bank account in Turkey at the time, you had it taken and moved to government funds. Liquidation commissions started to seize Turkish assets, just as 20 years later they did in the 1930s to the Jews. And then, of course, on April the 24th, 1915, the roundup of intellectual leaders in what was then Constantinople, it is now Istanbul. The first victims are always the poets, the writers, the lawyers, the intellectual leaders of the race that is to be exterminated. And then I have to say, of course, some of my relatives on April the 24th were offshore in troop ships because they were about to land at Gallipoli, and we Australians have April the 25th as our Anzac Day commemoration of all those who were killed by Turkish bullets. We've made peace with Turkey because it was, in a sense, not their fault. They were defending their homeland. But there can be no peace without justice, and that is the justice they've denied the Armenians. They used it as an excuse to round up the leaders and to begin the ethnic cleansing of Anatolia. The evidence for that is overwhelming. The great British historian Arnold Toynbee collected hundreds of statements in the Blue Books, testimony to how local government officials and police, obeying orders from central government, began the attack on the Christian Armenians. What is very, very important is the German diplomats and German missionaries. Germany was in league with Turkey. It was an ally of Turkey. And these people were so appalled at what their allies were doing in exterminating the Armenians, they wrote to Berlin about it. And their testimonies are in the files. This is very important evidence, overwhelming evidence from Turks' own allies. And then, of course, there were the Americans. In those days, the New York Times took photographs of those columns of men, old men and women and children, those tragic pictures of them beginning the death marches to the deserts. And there was Harold Morgenthau, we've heard of him already. He was the ambassador who actually went and spoke to people like Talat. And they told him, I quote, "Let us deal with these Christians as we please. We must bring the Armenian problem to an end in a final way, a final solution." That was the objective of the Young Turk government, to eliminate the race. And finally, there was a fact-finding commission sent out by the US government, led by Major General Harbord in 1919. And it collected overwhelming evidence about how the men in a particular town, in many towns, aged between 15 and 45, would be rounded up, taken away and killed. And the remainder would be the women, the old men and the young boys would be sent into the desert. There is no doubt at all, and America had no doubt. As late as 1951, there was a case in the International Court of Justice, the World Court, and the question arose, what was the meaning of genocide? And the American government filed with the court this statement, saying one of the most outstanding examples of the crime of genocide is the Turkish massacre of the Armenians. That was what the United States government told the World Court in 1951. Why is President Obama not saying it today? In 1984, the Genocide Convention is so important because it's one of the few international conventions that have been ratified by the United States. President Reagan signed it in 1984, and the Congress and Senate ratified it in 1987. Why now will Britain, at least Britain, has stopped using those threadbare excuses? Why won't Britain and America? We know, because Turkey is neuralgia. Well, they won't tell the truth, but they must tell the truth, because the truth will not be kept. There must be, firstly, an opening of the Turkish government archives. They must have a Freedom of Information Act. They must abolish Section 301 of the Turkish Code, which puts people and a number of journalists in prison for suggesting that it was genocide. That must be repealed. And there must be an opening of the archives so that historians, not just the lickspittle historians from Princeton that they pay, who occupy the Ataturk chair, paid for by the Turkish government. One of the most extraordinary things about researching this is to see these lickspittles who are being paid by the government, who are finding reasons for suggesting it wasn't genocide. Those archives, they're given unique access to the archives. The archives must be open to all historians. There must be an apology, and there must be reparations. There must be reparations. One appropriate form of reparations would be to give the Armenian Patriarchy, the Armenian Church, possession of those hundreds, I think there are over 1,000 churches that were originally Armenian churches throughout Turkey. And we have some hold over Turkey. Turkey very much wants to join the European Union. It's in its economic interest to do so. And it will not, it must not be allowed to join the European Union. Europe has a great history in developing human rights. Europe demands as membership a truth-telling. It demands that those who have committed great crimes should recognize, understand, and apologize for them. And I believe that Turkey must be denied the right of membership of Europe until it adopts and performs the most basic principles of European civilization. But ladies and gentlemen, racial hatred, the kind of racial and religious hatred that produced the Armenian genocide, exists today still. The example only a few months ago of the Safarov case. This is Safarov, the axe murderer from Azerbaijan, who several years ago, when billeted with a young Armenian from Nagorno-Karabakh, obtained an axe, stole into his room at night, and hit him 16 times on the head, killed him with that axe. It was in Hungary, and he was jailed for 30 years. A few years later, just 2 or 3 years later, when Hungary needed a $3 billion loan, it got it from the Azeris. And what the Azeris got in return was Safarov. He came back ostensibly to serve the rest of his sentence in an Azerbaijani prison. He was met at the airport with a hero's welcome. He never got near an Azeri prison. The president congratulated him, gave him a medal, a promotion, and his back pay. He was set free immediately, he was promoted, and he was rewarded for that monstrous axe murder of an Armenian. That shows the world. It had this value, I guess, that it showed the world the depth of hatred that is still out there, not from the Turks, but from the Azerbaijanis. And that little state of Nagorno-Karabakh is surrounded by a ring of hatred of snipers. I walked the line of control last year, and the bullets come every so often. And they, I think, are the Armenians that are still in danger of racial and religious hatred. They are the Armenians we should think of today and think of how to help in memory of the martyrs of 1915. Because there is a solution. It's one the Karabakhis came up with by themselves back in 1992 after the pogroms in Sumgait and Baku. It's independence, their right of self-determination. Because Nagorno-Karabakh is a mistake of history made by Stalin in 1922 at the instant people often don't realize this historical fact that Ataturk got at Stalin in 1922 to have Nagorno-Karabakh made part of Azerbaijan, not, as it should have been, part of Armenia, because of course its people are Armenians who had suffered as well in the genocide. And it's a marvelous country. I visited it for some days last year, a country in the clouds, in the high mountains. It was under siege in 1992 after those pogroms, and I want to remind you for a moment of that siege, because it was one of the worst war crimes in Europe since the Nazis. What happened was that Stepanakert, the capital with 50,000 people, children at schools, people in hospitals, was put under attack for months. They were bombed by the Azeri Air Force. They were shelled from Sushi, which was just above. The shells rained out, and they were targeted, those shells, on schools and on hospitals, and thousands were killed. I interviewed a number of survivors of the siege of Stepanakert. We think, or the world pictures Guernica, the Picasso picture of this town being bombed and shelled and women and children being killed. That was precisely what happened to Stepanakert in 1992. It was a war crime, and it went on for long enough to be a crime against humanity. Of course, the courageous Karabakians, with help from the diaspora, there was a famous Californian who came to help the self-defense. It was brilliant. They led a remarkable military achievement to take Shushi with the help of some liberated Russian tanks. And they made a lifeline, what we lawyers call a humanitarian corridor, through Lachin to Goris. And it was on that humanitarian corridor that the fate of Stepanakert was saved from starvation. And that, in law, my view, entitles Nagorno-Karabakh not only to keep it at the time, to keep it as a corridor, but to keep it as a corridor today. It is a humanitarian corridor, and it's their lifeline. Azerbaijan is taking action in international courts to pretend or to try to say that it has to be given back. They are fighting not only with the occasional bullet, not only with creatures like Safarov, they're fighting with legal cases, and those legal cases must be resisted. Lachin is now an essential part of Nagorno-Karabakh, and Nagorno-Karabakh is sufficiently distinctive, sufficiently independent to, under the right of self-determination in international law, to be its own country. The Azeris say, you're just part of Armenia. This is a pretext. But they're as much a part of Armenia as Scotland is a part of England. And what's happening to Scotland? It's having a referendum next year as to whether it wants independence. And it will be given independence. It will become an independent country. It's entitled and it's distinctive. And in the same way, the Karabakians are different. They've got these unique, wonderful rugs that are not replicated in Armenia. They've got their own very democratic system. They've got their own judges, their own officials that are not beholden to Armenian in any way. They tell jokes about Armenians, and Armenians tell jokes about them, largely to do with mules, I think. But they drink tea where Armenians tend to drink coffee. They drink a foul-tasting mulberry liqueur that Armenians wouldn't drink in a lifetime. But they have forged their own nation against attack and against the greatest repression. Just like East Timor, we gave East Timor its statehood. We gave Kosovo its statehood because they had been under attack from a surrounding country. They're entitled to secede in international law. Nagorno-Karabakh is more of a country than Liechtenstein or San Marino or Andorra, countries made up of a few thousand tax accountants. It's more of a country than Monaco, made up of a few thousand tax exiles. I dare say it's more of a country than the Vatican. But it is, ladies and gentlemen, the right of secession and the right to independence of a people that have developed in their own way and that are subject to persecution. Just as the Palestinians now have their own state, so should Nagorno-Karabakh. But the Nagorno-Karabakh is under threat. I visited a few months ago the airport at Stepanakert. It's a state-of-the-art airport. It is all ready to fly. Why are there no aeroplanes at the airport at Stepanakert? Because the Azeris threaten to shoot them down. This is a monstrous act of terrorism, a threat of terrorist action to shoot down passenger planes. It must be condemned as such. It means that Nagorno-Karabakh can't develop tourism. It takes you 6 hours to drive from Yerevan instead of a 20-minute flight. That's a terrorist threat. And just as we remember the martyrs of 1915, we must remember those who are today at risk of imminent invasion. And I think the United States can give them protection, the protection that comes with statehood. That may be too much to ask of the Obama government, but they, after all, deserve at least a recognition of their autonomy. They are Armenians, relatives involved in the genocide, since when they've carved out for themselves a distinctive and different country that needs the protection of statehood. So it may not be, it may be that the greatest assistance that America can give to the victims, the greatest commemoration that this country can give, is to assist these victims, not just by remembering the victims of the past, but ensuring safety for the potential victims of the future. It's very important that America come to Armenia's aid on this, because the danger is that Armenia will otherwise look to Russia, and Russia's record on human rights is becoming worse and worse, as the Magnitsky case shows, or to Iran. And Iran, of course, is a human rights pariah for the thousands of people who were killed at various times by the present government. They are, I suppose, friends in need, but it must be cautious. It is much better to have the friendship of the United States, and I'm sure that all that you can do to make your government aware of the need for support and the risk that the Karabakians are running today. So, in memory of the martyrs, and to keep their memory alive, let us determine today that their deaths shall have real meaning, that the commemoration shall lead to, eventually, to reparations from Turkey and to statehood for Nagorno-Karabakh. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robertson.